Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So really excited to be here. I'll kick it off with my introduction and Immersa, and then introduce our guest today. So this is part of a webinar series that we launched late last year, fall of last year, and we've seen the community continue to grow around it. We're really excited for those of you signed up and are able to join us today. My name is Aseem Chandra. I'm the founder CEO of Immersa. Immersa's focus on how to take product usage data and make it available for customer success and sales teams to help you operationalize data and identify where there's churn risk or growth opportunities in your install base at an account level. My guest today is Dan Ennis. And Dan was nominated and is one of the top 100 CS strategists in 2022. He was named the top 25 most creative CS leader last year. He is currently with Monday.com, which if you are tracking that company is on a tear in terms of the growth. And the conversation we're going to have today is really around the do's and don'ts of scaling customer success. And Dan has lived through this, continues to live through it. And I'm going to hand this over to Dan for his introduction. Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Aseem. Like Aseem mentioned, I manage the Scale Customer Success team here at Monday.com, and I've been with Monday for about 2.5 years now, and have helped kind of be on the ground floor when we built out the Scale subsegment here at Monday. But I've been in customer success for about a decade now, and have really had a lot of experience working with kind of different size companies along their trajectory, whether it's kind of a larger organization post going public like Monday now, or even earlier stage startups in the past as well. And so I've got a lot of experience with being able to work on scaling out the customer success practices when you can't just throw headcount at a problem at different stages of companies with different levels of infrastructure in place.
Great. So Dan, let's tell us a little bit about your previous experiences and where you worked before we get into the experience that you've had with Monday.
Absolutely. So I've been a part of prior organizations. So some of the formal customer success at an organization called Think HR, now Mineral, was a part of working with them as they built out some of their continued customer success practices, and as they continued to scale their team and their offerings, going from a kind of very traditional one person, one CSM doing everything post sales, right? So going from the concept of one point of contact for a customer period, to those scaling out the team when it comes to the different specializations. So specializing out implementation at some point, specializing out account managers at another point, as well as continuing to work on how we could help our customers better achieve their goals, because there was a fairly unique model there of B2B to B with that company, where we sold to people who gave that to their customers. So therefore, we needed to be able to scale adoption with their customers who were using our product. So that was where some of that began being built out. And then some experience at a company called Beekeeper, where a very similar process there, where they were a communication platform that was specifically for non-desk workers. And so being able to work with our teams and the maybe more desk-bound employees at some of those orgs to help roll this out and work with them on how do they scale that out to their employees. So that's what my prior background before Monday has looked a lot like, from a perspective of scaling and just being a part of the customer journey throughout those different organizations.
Perfect. So Dan, let's talk a little bit about Monday.com. So I think most of us are familiar, but for those that are not, it'd be great if you can share a little bit about what the company does. Katie says it's her favorite tool, mine too. But let's for the audience that's not familiar with what Monday does, maybe take a moment to explain that.
Absolutely. So Monday aims to be a work operating system where you can go in and not just manage projects, which might be how a lot of people think of Monday as project management, but go to perform any of your workflows. anything from creating a CRM, if you're not buying a purpose-built CRM, to building out your own ticket intake system, to managing projects and tracking progress on those different things as people might be thinking of that. And so Monday makes sure to be a hub where you can do all your work. So whether that's through natively being able to do that directly within Monday itself, or through connections, through connecting to other tools that might be purpose-built that talk to Monday. So that way you're able to have that one centralized work operating system where you are managing all of your work that you're doing. So that's in a high level, in a nutshell. And really people love it because of the customizable nature of what you can build in Monday, and that kind of very strong emphasis on that low code, being able to build out what you want within Monday, which I think from a customer success perspective is exciting because it keeps things fresh, because we're not targeting just one type of use case and one vertical where we go really deep in one industry. Keeps it both challenging, but also very exciting in the customer success team, because we work with such a diverse array of users and companies and user profiles as we help them accomplish their goals with Monday.
Very cool. Very cool. And, since we're going to be talking about scaling, Dan, I looked up a little bit of Monday's growth trajectory and share that with the audience. But in the 2.5 years that you've been part of the company started was roughly at 160 million in revenue or ARR in 2020, and then double that nearly in 2021 to 300 million. And then last year was not too shabby either, with 50+% growth to 460 million in 2022. And so clearly all because of you. Tell us more about how the CS team has evolved in all of that growth.
Absolutely. So the customer success teams work very closely with Monday being very much a product-led growth company, where truly following that land and expand model. We know that this might sound cliche to people to hear, but customers that want to expand and grow with a product are successful customers. So they might come in for one use case, and if they don't accomplish that use case, they're never going to want to expand and bring in other use cases. However, if they do find success with that, not only are they then happy with the result that they're getting with that particular use case that they maybe initially purchased Monday for, they now are realizing the opportunities of how it can benefit all these other use cases that they have that they might not have even realized going on that front. So with that, the customer success team works very closely with our account management team. I know we joke, and sometimes it's the topic of conversations about friction between customer success and sales, but at Monday, it's definitely not something that I feel like we've experienced particularly. There's a really close alignment where the sales team is very invested in customers being successful. So they want to make sure that they're working with customers who are experiencing success, because they know that that's how it snowballs and how people are wanting to use even more of Monday. So where we come in is helping make customers successful, helping advise on how to make sure that they're getting the most out of Monday and accomplishing their goals, which creates that snowball of a flywheel of customers who purchase Monday for use case X, experience success with that, realize they can do Y, expand into Y, and so on and so forth. And we come in and play a key role in that as a customer success organization. Got it.
So Dan, I was just curious if there's others in the audience that work at PLG companies or transforming to PLG companies. Looks like we have a little bit of both going on in the audience. So let's maybe spend a few minutes on this. Katie, Gary, Evan, if you have other questions you'd like to ask of Dan, please post those there and I'll bring those up for you. But love to hear where others are from, which companies do you represent, and what kinds of questions you might have for Dan. So please participate as an audience, ask your questions. We'll keep that live and interesting. So Dan, I think you kind of touched on one of the key points that I frequently hear from PLG companies, which is, what does the handoff between the sales and the CS team look like, right? And it varies a lot depending on the type of company, the type of product, the scale at which you're selling, et cetera. But tell me a little bit more about how that works for you at Monday.
Absolutely. So looks different depending on the segment as well, and how involved the CSM, the human individual that actual human CSM will be on the account. So looks a little different on our scale side as opposed to some of the other sides. So there's two components to it. Number one is a very thoroughly detailed actual handoff object that creates and captures all of the information and is very robust in our CRM, because we understand that we don't want to just have a great meeting with conversation, ensuring that's going from sales to CS or to our implementation team. We want to make sure that's captured so that future people can look back at that when that happens, right? And whether it's because an account is moving from one CSM to another, or for whatever reason, whatever could be going on, we want to make sure that that's documented. So the first part is a very thorough kind of document there, and then a brief kind of touch point scheduled with the CSM, whoever might be involved from implementation, depending on where that account is, and the sales representative to see, is there any extra color or anything that needed to be shared beyond that, just to sync on the plan with the customer. But we really try to put our emphasis on what's documented, because we want to make sure that that is something that includes all the information someone would need to know to be able to look at this account fresh and understand, what do I need to do? And we really do believe that that documentation is extremely key, and our sales reps do a great job at that on our sales team.
So Michael, as a customer to Monday.com, I've actually experienced that handoff, and there's actually a really interesting. There's a couple of questions here, one from Gary, another one from Michael. So I'll bring those both up. Both are relevant to this conversation. So Michael wants to know, what does that handoff object consist of, right? So when a sales executive signs off on a deal, and I assume it's going to be a little bit different, significantly different, depending on which segment that the account is in. Because for us it was pretty self-service, very transparent. We couldn't even tell that there was a transition. But I'm sure for enterprise accounts, it's probably not the case with more complex use cases. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and I'll pick up Gary's question next.
Absolutely. And so within that, it includes things like, what is the actual use case that they want to use Monday for? Detailed that as much as possible at a high level. What were the big win points? What was it that caused this deal to be won? Like, what was it that brought that over the line for this customer? Because it's helpful for the CSM to be aware of on a long-term basis. Okay, what were the parts of Monday that were most important to this customer? It includes what were any potential challenges that they saw in the process, so they can include that. So again, the CSM can be aware of, if they're coming from spreadsheets and they're concerned about just getting a team of their employees to use a tool, right? Like, that's a great thing to be aware of for someone going in on the front end. So those are at the highest level, the use case, what was most important to them that helped kind of seal the deal, and what were the potential challenges. And then within that, there's also, of course, some contact mapping. Here are the people that you'd want to work with. Here's calling out specifically which are the actual decision makers who you're going to work with during the implementation process, all those kinds of things. And then maybe some color about those particular contacts, in addition to, like, we of course track the actual contacts within our CRM as well, but they give that context around those as it relates to that new deal. So that way there's any context on who they spoke with and everything like that. So trying to make it really clear there, and then any potential growth they could see down the line.
Got it. I think that resonates quite a bit, not just establishing what is it that the team is trying to accomplish, but who's the team that you're working with. Gary Hoffman is with a legal tech PLG company, and his question, which I think would resonate with you, since you serve a large number of customers, including SMB accounts, so do they. And his question is, how do customers get to realize that they're underperforming when they do not communicate, right? So are there signals that your team looks for, particularly in the SMB segment, and where you may be working with the founder or the executive at the company? How do you communicate with them when they're not communicating back to you? How do you find those signals of whether the customer is not performing well in your product? Absolutely.
So that's a great question there, in the sense of, excuse me, what we work on here is, obviously, end of the day, the most helpful thing is, does the customer feel that they're having success with what they're accomplishing, right? Because that trumps, end of the day, most any database signal you could put in, right? Because if they purchased it to do X and they're accomplishing X, they don't care what the data shows. They're happy because they're doing X. And vice versa. If they're bought it to do X, they don't care if the data looks fantastic. they're not accomplishing X. I bought Monday to do this. That's what matters, end of the day. So most ideally, you're having those conversations. But transparently, when you're not, we have done a lot of work on finding what those signals are that point to customers that are not being successful. And we can and what we've done is we've done a lot of work on translating those from not just feature-based, product-based metrics, because transparently, that's very insularly focused if it's positioned solely that way. Customer doesn't care about a feature for a feature's sake. But transitioning those as to what does that mean for a customer? If we've noticed that there's been a large dip or lack of adoption in, for example, using some of our communication features, right? Rather than just saying, you're not using the communication features, that's usually successful. That might not resonate with a customer so much as sharing with them, we've noticed that this isn't being used as much. We're concerned that you might be having a lot of transitioning for your customers as they're context switching for your team, as they're having to communicate about what's going on in Monday elsewhere. Are they doing that? Are you experiencing that? Or talking about how we know that those communications help foster that social environment that's conducive to adoption. Are you experiencing that? Because we're not seeing this. And so positioning this not just as, hey, here's data, because a customer doesn't care about that for its own sake. We try to be very data driven, but we understand that while we need that data to make decisions and want to share that with customers, we want to make sure that we're doing our best to communicate that in a way that resonates and is valuable to them. So that's what I would say a lot of what we do is we spend time looking at those signals, which we've done a lot of work to see what are the meaningful signals. Because with a product as diverse as Monday with so many features, it's not as simple as, well, they'll be using feature X a certain amount of times because people's use cases are so diverse. They might not need feature X and be very successful. So that's just an example of how we approach that and how we make sure that that's being positioned from customer-centric perspective, which I think we'll get into in a little bit about how there's kind of this myth that scale is all about doing things in an automated way and losing the customer a little bit, when that's absolutely not the case. It's about being.
So Dan, let's hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to it. I think that's an important point that you just made, but I'm going to go back to the point you made about data driven. And there's actually some additional questions starting to pop up. Ragna actually is appreciative of the concept of structuring the handover, so something they might want to try at their company. But the key point here on data driven, and the question that follows from Ragna is about how do you gather feedback through surveys or other mechanisms. I'm curious. I mean, I'm sure you do. A lot of companies do NPS surveys, so that's obviously a very relevant signal. But in terms of data-driven processes, can we double-click that a little bit? Like, what kind of data feeds do you use? Do you use product usage data as a PLG company? What does that signal look like for you? So maybe take a moment to take us through that part of the discussion.
Absolutely. So nail on the head there. We do a lot based on product usage data. We do look at NPS. However, we understand that, and this is something that I'm grateful for others having mentioned as well, that NPS is a metric that is a signal, but we can often misuse it. So it's something that we're aware of, but not necessarily something that is super heavily involved directly on some of the things we do on the customer success side. But we do send out surveys that do talk about what level of success they're having with Monday, that we target not to every user, where maybe the NPS, right, is something that typically in most products targets the whole swath of users, as opposed to something that's targeting those that we already designated in our CRM as champions, right? So something that talks about how successful they're feeling, or how empowered they're feeling to accomplish what they need to within Monday. So we do that on occasion, and we take that feedback as something that we look at, because that's their direct response. But in addition to that, yes, we look at product data. What we do is we try to see, and this is where our BizOps team, and I know that a tool like Immersa can also be helpful for those that don't have maybe an organization that's as built out to do it the way we were able to, so they could use another tool out there. But what they do is they looked at that data and they help reverse engineer what were successful customers looking like, as well as what were customers that churned? What did they look like over time? And so we were able to understand and get a strong idea of what that looks like from a data perspective. And a lot of that is, yes, product usage when we're not talking to, if we're not talking to a customer directly right away, which in the scale side, we're not always talking to them directly. So we can use those pointers to understand where is that needed, because we're relying on the data that has been shared to show these are customers that are likely to churn, or these are those that are likely on a path to success. You can help accelerate that growth.
Got it. So you have a broader thesis around scaling. So maybe let's turn our attention there. You talked about the 4 pillars of scaling when we had our initial conversation, data being one of those, but could you talk a little bit about what the other 3 pillars are and how do those combine to work to create scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So when talking about kind of the pillars of scale, I think even before the pillars, just to kind of give as a groundwork, is the idea of thinking through what the goal is of your scaling out, what you're trying to accomplish, and trying to make sure you're keeping the customer at the center. They're undergirding. So if these are the 4 pillars, that's the foundation on which the 4 pillars are built, is the customer. Because end of the day, when scaling, whether it's because of external pressures or whatever other reason, you want to make sure that what you're doing is delivering what the customer needs, when and how they need it. And that's what scale is about. And then to support that is where these 4 pillars come in, right? So the data, which is allowing you to understand the signals of these customers at scale, because you're not able to talk to all of them. And again, that's feature, not bug. So what is the data that you need? So understanding and looking through what is it that is important and going to be impactful. And this is why you start with the other component, like I mentioned, of that foundation of the customer and what your goal is and what that journey is that you want to see, because that's what will tell you which data is important. And then from there, you can look at the process, right? So what is it that you want to accomplish? What is that journey? What is it that you want to have be something that's done at a human intervention level? What do you want to have that is automated within a product? Or what do you want to have that is accomplished via other methods? So you're thinking through, what are the processes? What is it that you want to actually do, right? So think through, playbooks, plays, the journey, all of those things fall broadly under the category of processes. And I think that these are the kinds of questions that you want to be asking before you get to this third one, which is technology. Too often, I think companies, when trying to think about scaling, go straight to the technology because they rightly know they do need technology to do this, right? That there's no problem with going to technology. The problem, though, is technology is no substitute for strategy. So you need the strategy that will determine how and what technology is going to empower you to do that. For example, so you would need to be able to understand what is the data you want to look for, what are you missing from a data perspective. So maybe you want a tool from a technology perspective that's going to do that and help you identify that data. Maybe you've identified that you want something that's automated messaging in product and you don't really have a way to do that right now. So you need technology that's going to empower that. Fill in the blank, because these other components are what will dictate what technology you need. So the technology supports the strategy, not the other way around, right? You don't want technology dictating your strategy. It's the other way around. So it's a key pillar that empowers the rest, but just make sure not to start on that pillar first. Otherwise, you'll end up with a tech stack that's kind of hodgepodge put together, as opposed to one that serves the strategy you're trying to accomplish. Yeah. And then lastly, the community being the fourth pillar. Having customers in a way where they can learn from each other is something that is massive. It's something that both helps foster that social adoption, because they're getting to talk to other users and encourage each other and learn from each other's use cases, as well as transparently, if a user is asking a question there, they're not asking your support team. They're not asking your customer success team, which therefore from a scaling perspective just reduces the amount of direct need there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, look, the 4 areas you covered just now, first, data, second, process, what is the customer journey and what's the process that supports the customer journey? then moving to what technology you need to get to the right, to get a response to the right questions along that customer journey. And then finally, community. I think it's so important, the 4 A's you talked about. So talk a little bit about how do you measure scaling? What metrics do you use? Now, the most common one that I hear about from CS teams is coverage ratios, right? How many accounts does a customer success manager or person or team cover in their portfolio? And those ratios vary depending on enterprise, mid-market, SMB, et cetera. But are there better ways to think about how you're scaling, and are you scaling well? How do you think about it?
Yeah, and so I do think that within that, there's a couple of different ways that you would want to approach it. Number one, I think that while those are helpful and they can be good, I don't think that those should be the primary. Simply because, again, it's almost like the technology, where it should be in service of the goal, not the goal itself, right? Like, my goal isn't necessarily to get that number as high as possible, right? That's maybe a corollary to it. But what I want to do is, depending on the goal of the team, right, which obviously as a customer success team, those boil down to gross retention, net retention, adoption as a leading indicator of these different things, right? With the customer segment, based on what they need within their particular segment, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit, the idea of segmenting and how that can be approached. From there, we would then, yes, try to then get the efficiency of, is the account load right? How are they covering these different accounts? But starting with those goals and knowing what you want to accomplish from a process perspective and from the high level outcome, determining that the other way around. Because you might, if you're just going for the other goal, you might in theory feel like you're getting the right outcomes by having a really high account to CSM ratio in this scaled segment. But if you're not hitting the business goals that you truly want to hit, you haven't actually scaled that. You've just reduced your business outcomes. And so that is a bit of a moving slider based on what it is that your outcomes are. And as well as transparently, are we talking about looking at a situation where you're doing that just in response to the current economic environment, where you've just got to figure out how to make do with the existing headcount that you have? For some organizations, as some are feeling hiring freezes or even layoffs, as some organizations have gone through, versus are we talking in a growth period where you're proactively getting ahead of that? And so that's where I think, from my perspective, it's not a black and white answer on the only way to look at that.
I think you just made a really important point, Dan, and I think it's worth sort of reiterating that a bit, which is, are you being forced into creating scale because there's attrition, because there's economic headwinds, because there's layoffs, et cetera, or are you being proactive and planning for growth? And those are different types of scaling mechanisms the scaling opportunities. What's your advice for companies? I mean, many companies right now, as you know, of course, there's a lot of over hiring that occurred in the 2020, 2021 timeframe in response to the pandemic as everybody moved online. And then, there's a little bit of that indigestion going on right now, where companies are shedding a lot of weight and, cutting employees, and a very unfortunate situation for the tech industry at the moment. But for either type of scaling, what would be your advice to companies that are going through that now, whether that's because they're continuing to grow as you guys are, or whether that's because they're cutting back on their employees right now? What advice should you have for them? How should they think about the problem differently?
Yeah, so the challenges are a little different within that, to your point. So I'll start with saying, regardless of where your company is on that spectrum right now, to borrow a phrase that's used in another way, to borrow the phrase, right, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is today, right? If to kind of borrow that phrase, if the best time to have begun scaling this out was at the beginning of your building your customer success practice and thinking through how you could scale that down the line, the second best time is now. So within that, regardless of where you find yourself on that spectrum, begin thinking about that, begin building towards that. So I would say it's less necessarily that the things you need to think about are extremely different and more the challenges are different. So for example, for a company that may be doing this a bit more reactively because you are suddenly in a case where you'd counted on doubling your CSM headcount by the end of this year, and then you just found out that you're not only not doubling your CSM headcount, you're actually going to by the end of Q1 have 70% of your CSM team, and the company's needing you to manage that same book of business. The challenge in those cases will be to still set a strategy in that case, because I think that the worst thing a company can do in that case is just try to, using the existing CSMs that they have left, for example, try to accomplish and do the exact same thing. So throw more accounts on some CSMs, don't change what they're setting the customer expectations to do. So just being reactive and expecting more from less is one challenge. And the second challenge within that is truly to, like I said, set a goal and strategy. What is it that is going to be different for the customer journey? How can we deliver value to the customers? Because a lot of times when that happens and it's just a cost saving measure, and this is something that I know I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking to an audience of CS leaders, that the CS leader feels like the person that gets lost in the shuffle there within the company is the customer, because they're expected to just get a less experience, as the company is saying, do more with less people. So as a customer success leader, think through what are the ways that we can still add value and help move customers through the customer journey, which is something I actually saw someone mention in the chat, which I think is a fantastic resource to think about. So thanks, Samuel, for that. I think is a great way to think through how can we continue to move customers through the journey, knowing we can't rely on a one-to-one interaction to do it, where we may have historically.
Very well said. Yeah. Yeah.
So from those
I agree. I
think
think
reactively, yeah.
Yeah, I think very well said, which is, how do you, first of all, understanding what your customer's journey looks like when it first originates from when they first see an ad or join a webinar or, find out about you, and then they move to your website and into your product, and then, through your product, sort of deeper and deeper in. There's different tools that are available to help you figure out what they're experiencing. Now, from your lens, how do you connect the dots, Dan, from, when there's different stages of the customer journey, how do you connect the dots across, and how do you make sure that they're progressing through that journey? What tools do you use? Just maybe talk a little bit about the tech and tooling as well.
Absolutely. So from our perspective, we use, because a lot of that is related to product data, which is not just activated users, right? It's actual number of how they're using it, because we understand that that's something that's really important. So as we've mapped what that journey looks like, for us, we do primarily look on and rely on our BI tools to help measure where a customer is within that journey. And if they're off track on that, obviously within BI tools, a CSM could go in and run queries and identify different things that they want to run themselves. But what we've done is we've set it up in such a way that they have access to reports in there that specifically call out the accounts that are off track on that journey, that are moving off of that. And then from there, it highlights these are the ones that might need maybe a one-to-many campaign or a one-to-many initiative first. And then those that are still on there, because we see how long they've been off of that journey and how far they are, what's that deviation, because we have those different milestones in adoption, so that they can then know where do they follow up from a human perspective. At what point does that human intervention come in to help mitigate risk, for example, right? To help get them back on track. So for us, it primarily has been, because of what we've been able to build out, our BI tools. But I do know that there are customer success platforms that do that for organizations, as well as, again, tools such as, I know what Immersa does and what others have done that help identify what those milestones are. So that's where that can come in, but that's what we've historically used.
Got it. So a lot of interesting questions, some that have been delivered privately in the Q&A channel and some that are up here. So I'm going to go try and hit as many of these as possible. And maybe, Dan, just in the interest of time, as pointed and sharper response you can offer so we can get through a few of these. So Gary Hoffman brings up the point, what you want to know is when will the customer renew and will they renew? So how do you address that? What tools or advice you have for somebody who's trying to figure that out?
Yeah, absolutely. Short version, look at your customers that have renewed historically and map out what does that look like? What does their journey look like? What of those that have churned and not renewed? So you can determine a renewal likelihood. And then you can use that to determine what level of human intervention is needed and when to get that confirmation and when in the timeline that comes into place. And the more you see a high level of accuracy or a non-high level of accuracy from what you've built allows you to iterate. All these things I talk about with mapping these journeys and using data are iterative. You're not doing a set it and forget it. You're coming up with a model, looking at those customers that have either renewed or churned to map where you think involvement would be needed, and then iterate accordingly.
Got it. Now, there's a question in the Q&A session from Stamatis. The question is, what are your thoughts on the best setup between customer success and the product team in order to translate client feedback in a scale environment? So how do you bring client feedback from the CS team to the product team is how I interpret this question in a scale environment.
Great question. So we use a very similar mechanism transparently to the rest of our customer success teams. We try to make it so that customer feedback is customer feedback, and we associate it at an account level so that you see feedback related, that can aggregate ARR associated with feedback. But then we also aggregate that. So if it's a similar request, it's with another broader request there. So whether that's coming from us as the customer success team because we are hearing it, or customers have the ability to submit feedback directly within the product, those are the two main ways of capturing that. And then we've got kind of internal mechanisms for liaising between our product and customer success teams to ensure alignment there.
Okay. There are several questions from both Sam and Heather around mapping customer journeys. What's a good tool out there? They mentioned Lucid, Miro, et cetera, but are there other ways in which you've come across where teams map customer journeys to understand how the customer is actually going through their products and use cases?
Yeah, it all depends on what you're trying to do. Is it something you're trying to have more visual? Like you've mentioned with a couple of those, Miro, and I would add Canva in there and things like that to create different resources. Are you trying to have this listed more as a flow that you're kind of tracking steps? You've got anything as simple as I hate to say something as simple as a spreadsheet, but that's starting there is better than not starting at all. But tracking that is important. I would be remiss to not mention how we are able to do that within Monday directly. We're able to track a customer journey and map that out, both visually with some of our Monday features within our docs, as well as just as a process within a board. We've mapped out what that looks like. But there's any number of tools, and it depends on what your specific need is for the way you want to do that. But I think that you've touched on a lot of the big ones there.
Yeah. Sam, you're bringing out an important point on the Q&A or on the chat session about how CSM teams generally cover onboarding, retention, sometimes not even differentiate very well between those. So one of the things I will mention is that, from an Immersa standpoint, we've actually created customer journeys and broken that out into 5-6 different stages. And onboarding, retention, et cetera, are pretty distinct stages. And there's very distinct activities that we've discovered that need to happen. So if there's interest in that conversation, please reach out. Happy to help you with and take you through what we've learned. Okay, so there's a question from Ragna about how do you capture feature enhancement requests and bugs? Do you have a one-door policy and separate types of requests, or do you separate upfront visibility for the client? So I think the question is kind of pointing to, again, the lines of getting feedback to your product team, but more specifically around bugs and issues with the product.
I mean, yes, short version, right? Like, so there's different cues for looking at things that are bugs that are affecting existing features that should be working in a certain way versus an enhancement request. So I think that those are treated differently on the internal side, of course. And then, like every company, everything's triaged and prioritized based on impact, visibility, low-hanging fruit, ease of fix, right? All those kinds of things that go into all of a prioritization model.
Yeah. So Dan, I'm going to just put it out there if anybody has any final questions that they'd like to ask of you. But while that's coming up, one of the questions I do have around the recent environment that we've seen, which is kind of leading to that forced scaling for a lot of teams. What's your advice to anyone who's been recently laid off or finds themselves, in a situation where they have to lay off a part of their team? What advice would you offer to either one of those two types of scenarios that we see pretty often these days? Particularly from a customer success lens, right? I'm talking about CS teams, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. So great question, and one that I want to give a second to be thoughtful here, because both sides of that equation are difficult for people, right? Whether you're the leader having to do that, or you've been the one impacted. That said, obviously, both sides are difficult. With that being an imbalance, one of those being significantly more difficult. So for those that have been laid off, in the customer success space, the first part, and this is going to sound cliche, but have grace with yourself. Take what your time is, go on your pace, because it is a loss. There can be a pressure, and especially for those that were high performers or that were driven in their career, to get right back at it right away and hit the ground running. And in theory, that sounds great and nice and able to do that. However, often there's a warning, there's a downtime period. So have that grace with yourself that you're not going to necessarily be able to hit the ground running as fast as you would like to be able to. If you are, that's fantastic, go for it. But if you're not, there's nothing. That's not something wrong with you as the person doing that. Then lean on your network. Don't be afraid to ask for introductions. Hopefully you've been building your network before this. Again, same thing, like I mentioned earlier with scaling out, best time to have built a network was months to years ago. Second best time is now. But if you're doing that, make sure that when you're working and asking for introductions or asking for things from someone in this process, still remember the principles that you applied as a CSM when you were making asks of customers, which is really that you still want to make sure you're providing them value. So if it's somebody that you already have an established relationship with and you've done that, yes, feel free, go ahead, just make that ask. Hey, can you make this intro in such and such a place, because you've already built that relationship. But if you haven't already, make sure you're finding ways to add value. And that would be the kind of final component to this, would be find ways to use this time to still be developing you, to still be growing in those skills, whether that's taking this time that you'll now have more downtime to contribute to, whether it's LinkedIn or a blog or different ways to write out what you've done in the past and help build that experience out. So I'll pause there. That's kind of the first one I would say related to those that were being laid off, and identifying that. And then for those that are going through the process on the other side as a leader, having to do that, similarly, first is you're really needing to manage up and manage down on both sides of that. The manage up is being transparent and advocating with the leadership above you about what expectations can now look like. Because typically for a leader, and the customer success leader, they're not the one who made the call that layoffs were needed, right? So they're needing to manage up with those that help make those decisions on, this is what we need to be successful now. Can't have the headcount, this is what we need to do, or this is what successful looks like now as far as changing processes. So a big part of that is learning to manage up, which can be a difficult skill in and of itself. And we could have a whole webinar just about learning to manage up, but that's one component. And the second is, again, it sounds cliche, but have grace with your teams. They're going through a difficult time. Those that are still there, some will feel survivor's guilt of, oh my goodness, like so-and-so that was like, oh, I thought they were doing better than me. They might be feeling fear. They might be feeling any number of uncertainty or demotivation as they just look at the amount of work that they might feel they have to do. So have grace with your team and over communicate. Be transparent as much as you can with your teams about the things you're doing to advocate for, and work on their goals and their customers.
Dan, thank you. That was wonderful advice. I think for both parties, it's never easy in either situation, and good advice. I think Michael is sharing some of his personal experiences here as well. I want to leave on a more positive note. I think I will say, over the past, I've been part of this industry, in the tech industry, over 25 years now, and what I've found is that people are more than willing to help in any situation, and what you have to do is ask. And a lot of times I see people hesitate to ask, and whether it's their confidence that's shaken, whether it's whatever personal situation they might be in that moment, but ask, and you'll be surprised by the help you receive and the empathy that you receive. So let's close there. Fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it, Dan. To the audience, thank you so much for participating and asking your questions. We're going to do this every week, and we have a new and exciting guest show up here every week. We've been very fortunate with the guests we've had so far, and you can find recordings of previous conversations on our website at immersa.co under resources and events. And if you have someone in mind that you think should be part of our forum as a guest, please introduce us or introduce yourself. We'd love to talk to you. If you have questions for Dan or for me after this conversation, you can reach out to either one of us. Dan, what's the best way for people to approach you?
Yeah, best way would just be to find me on LinkedIn. I'll drop my LinkedIn there in the chat so people can see it, but that'd be the easiest way. Just reach out to me there. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, and whether we're just chatting over LinkedIn or leads to a different conversation offline.
Awesome. Dan, thank you. Thank you for that. And similarly, you can reach out to me at my LinkedIn or at aseem@immersa.co. And I look forward to seeing many of you next week. We will have a new guest. We'll share that information on our website here shortly. Dan, thank you so much for your time, and audience, thank you so much.